are still a few folks signing on in order to get the most out of our time. Let's begin. My name is Eric Malin. I direct a program here at Duke's Keenan Institute for Ethics on Democracy and Higher Education. And we're doing our first webinar on crucial issues in this space. And today we're focusing on threats to higher education in Florida. Really pleased to have the panel that we have today. And after some brief remarks that I will make and introductions, we'll turn it over to the panelists. Let me briefly introduce, let's say one other thing, which is that there will be a time for you to ask questions. You can use the question and answer button on the bottom of your Zoom, and we will curate that and hopefully get to many of your questions toward the end of our hour together. I'm very pleased that Professor Robert Casanello has joined us. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. He has a PhD in history from University of Central Florida and is the author of, amongst other things, To Render Invisible Jim Crow and Public Life in New South Jacksonville. He's also done films on related topics. He is the United Faculty of Florida president at the University of Central Florida and deeply involved in the issues that are of concern to us. Very pleased to have the student perspective joining us. Sophia Brown is an English major and also a rhetoric and writing minor at the New College of Florida. And we'll talk more about the New College and why it's so important for this conversation. She has extensive experience in executing collaborative projects and is the editor-in-chief for the student-run campus newspaper. I have a feeling Sophia couldn't have imagined what she would be dealing with when she took on that role. And so, Sophia, thanks for taking time to join us. Also really glad to have Professor Timothy Kaufman Osborne, who is from Whitman College. He joined the faculty there in 1982 and was appointed to the position of Baker Ferguson Professor of Politics and Leadership in 1996. He has held a variety of leadership roles in political science, including at the Western Political Science Association and on the executive councils of the American Political Science Association. He is now a professor emeritus and just has a book that came out with Duke University Press called The Autocratic Academy, Re-envisioning Rules Within America's Universities. And I look forward to reading that. Finally, Representative Anna Eskamani is in legislative session. We are very hopeful that she will be joining us in about 10 minutes. And she is a graduate of the University of Central Florida in the Gender Studies Department, which is interesting given what's going on in Florida. And has been very involved in these issues. So we look forward to welcoming Representative Eskamani. So just by way of introduction, and really I only want to take a couple of minutes. Why are we focusing on Florida? We're focusing on Florida really for two reasons. One is it has in many ways become ground zero for attacks on public higher education. And so not only is Florida the most egregious example of what's happening in the country, but it also has very important national implications. And it has important national implications for two reasons. One is, as many of you know, Governor Ron DeSantis has higher political aspirations and is likely to soon announce his candidacy for the Republican nomination for President of the United States. So what's happening in Florida has national implications. And also because one thing that those of us who are involved in this issue are noticing is that there seems to be a national playbook. There seems to be a very consistent set of things that conservative politicians are doing, whether it's going after diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it is questioning the existence of tenure, whether it is interfering with traditional norms of university governance, all of these things happening in Florida. And so the conversation about Florida has really important national implications and implications for our colleagues down the road at UNC Chapel Hill. And our project in democracy and higher education is deeply involved in supporting our colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill. Interestingly, there's been some pushback in Florida on some of the most egregious parts of HB 999. The Florida Senate has pushed back on some of that, and we'll have some chance to talk about whether the center is actually holding and what the national implications for that will be. The last thing I want to say is, and Sophia will get to this in a few minutes, the new college, which is a public small liberal arts college, has really become ground zero for the attacks. Ron DeSantis has said that he would like it to be the Hillsdale of the South. And as you know, Hillsdale is a private Christian conservative school, and private schools have every right to do that. Public institutions are different. They have replaced the president. They have replaced the board of trustees. And what's happening there is probably the worst example of what's happening in terms of attacks on higher education. And so we will feature what's happening at the new college. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn the first part of the webinar over to my colleague, Professor Robert Casanello. And I want to ask him to sort of talk about what's happening, and in particular, the faculty response, since he is the head of the faculty union at the University of Central Florida, and how faculty are pushing back on these attacks. So, Robert, thank you for joining us, and welcome your comments now.
Well, thank you. Just wanted to correct my bio really quick. I got my PhD at Florida State University, not University of Central Florida. No, that's okay. But I have a long history in Florida and Florida public education, so that could be fodder for questions later. Faculty response has been really varied. I'm union president, like you had mentioned, and so a lot of faculty do come to me for guidance. We get some guidance from the union, and some guidance we have to kind of make up on the cuff. And I would say the concerns that come to me have to be filtered through whether a faculty member is contingent faculty or not. I do hear from tenured faculty. Oftentimes when I do talk to tenured faculty, they are concerned, but ultimately they say, well, I have tenure, so we'll see what tenure's worth, right? And of course, I know at some point we're going to talk later about the threats to tenure in Florida, I'm sure. So that's part of this. It's integrated into this question we're talking about. But for those who are tenure track or people who can be non-reappointed, those meaning instructor lecturers, they are very concerned, and I hear from them often. They want to speak to me privately. Sometimes they'll be in small groups and invite me to a conversation on Zoom, and I'll talk to them. And they just quite frankly say, can I be fired for doing, for teaching X, Y, and Z? And unfortunately, I have to tell them, I don't know, because the policies are vague, the laws are vague. What the provost will and won't do is vague, because the provost is first and foremost, wants to be, and this is provost all over, not just UCF, wants to be in the good graces of the legislature and the governor, obviously. So, I do have to tell them the range of possibilities, and that's sort of what I have to counsel them on. And invariably, when I do speak to instructor lecturers, they really kind of heavily lean towards self-censorship, which I think is the real intent of all this. Tenured faculty, less so. I don't hear tenured faculty disclosing to me that they plan to self-censor. They are concerned about discipline, but instructor lecturers, tenure track faculty are concerned about losing their jobs, because they could be non-reappointed, and this is true in any state college universities, but they could be non-reappointed any year without cause. Tenured faculty can only be terminated with cause. So I think that really kind of makes the responses I hear from faculty sort of, depending on which batch of rank they are, the concerns that I hear and the responses that I hear concerning a lot of this legislation.
Robert, let me ask you, something you said is really interesting. I just wanted to probe you, if you don't mind, which is
sure.
The difference between what the legislation is going to eventually, what the law is eventually going to be, and that's There's difference in the Senate bill. The courts have gotten deeply involved in this in Florida versus the overall chilling effect that this is going to have. How do you balance those two phenomena?
It's hard because, you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So I'm tenured, so I'm sort of in the batch of people who have tenure and are contemplating, well, what's the strength of tenure and tenure protections, right? But this is certainly the byproduct of this legislation. And it goes back to 2021 with the intellectual diversity surveys. And it's kind of built up the next year with HB 7 and now this year, HB 999. And I think the real intent of the legislation, not only on the face of it, is trying to ban this stuff, but also to have the byproduct of chilling speech. So for example, if we take, I know this was last year, but when HB 7 was sort of in our scopes, I had people,
folks what HB
I'm sorry, HB 7 is the prohibitive racial concepts legislation where instructors were assumed to be indoctrinating students in a variety of different racial concepts. And so these things were prohibited with the HB 7 legislation. And with that legislation, again, it was really only about race. It was only, don't teach this race concept, that race concept, this race concept. But I had people coming up to me and saying, well, I teach, queer history, or I teach, intersectionality. I teach about trans people. Should I stop? Right. And there was nothing in the legislation about that at all. Right. And there was certainly nothing in any prohibitions about sexuality and the teaching of sexuality for colleges and universities. Yet the chilling effect was such that people who were teaching, subjects of the subaltern themselves felt it must also apply to them, even though it was not explicit.
Good. Thank you for that. And are you at all buoyed or feeling that the center might hold with the recent Senate pushback on some of the most egregious parts of HB 999?
Well, I mean, the problem is the center is still unacceptable, right? I'm pretty confident, if you want to call it the center will probably hold, because I think, the Senate, the Florida Senate realizes that there's a lot of money being poured into these lawsuits, and they know that there's more than likely going to be a lawsuit over HB 999 and the union decertification bill. And they've already spent a great deal of money defending HB 7 and a variety of other pieces of legislation unrelated to higher ed in the courts. I mean, the figures in the millions and millions of dollars on legal fees and things just to defend pieces of legislation. So I think in that regard, the House is probably going to give in to the Senate version. But if you read the Senate version, I mean, it's a little more general. It's a little more, amorphous, if you will, on some of these concepts and things, but it's still pretty unacceptable, and it's still a threat to academic freedom. It's just less so than the HB 999 version.
Okay, Robert, thank you for that really good kind of introduction to this. I'm really pleased that Representative Escamani has just joined us in the middle of, I think, what is a legislative session. And so thank you for taking time in the middle of this to do this with us. You've been a really important voice in Florida around the politics and legislation going after public higher education. And Robert, from his union role, has talked a little bit about that. And I did an introduction of you just a little earlier. And I wonder if you could talk about kind of the view from the House, the Florida House, where you sit representing, I believe, Orlando and District 42, on sort of the current state of the attacks on public higher education in Florida.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join y'all. And yes, I am on the House floor right now. I just stepped back into a room called the Bubble, and so I'm watching the
Thank you for
House
doing
floor.
That.
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize, for the chaotic nature of my appearance. But it's such an honor to be here. And thank you so much for hosting this very important conversation. So again, my name is Anna Escamani. I'm proud to serve District 42, as you mentioned, the state legislature, and also a pleasure to be alongside so many colleagues that I can call friends and allies in our efforts to protect academic freedom. Robert actually is at the University of Central Florida, which is my alma mater. And I carry 2 BAs from UCF, 2 masters, and now getting my PhD. So the issues of academic freedom are very near and dear to my heart, as I'm someone who is living and breathing it, and actually learned about the theories like CRT in my PhD program. And so you can color me shocked when I see my colleagues, especially on the right, conflate ideology with theory and not really understand the distinction or the consequences of their policies and of their words. And so with that said, we are in the middle of this fight. Actually, as we gather for this conversation, Senate Bill 266, which is the Senate version of House Bill 999, is literally being heard in committee on the Senate side. And that's the last committee stop. Both bills will be coming to the House floor and the Senate floor, I assume, next week. And I want to just stress that advocacy does work. And I think that there's, definitely a challenge, because I think academia is so good at understanding and studying issues, but we're kind of taught to not speak out on it, right? We write an academic paper, we get it published, it's read by our peers, but it never necessarily leaves that ivory tower of academia into everyday life. And what ends up happening is those with a political agenda will sometimes co-opt our research and use it for a political motive that is not reflective of what our intent was, let alone what the conclusions were of our research. And it's been a very interesting journey for me as someone who kind of sits in these both worlds of academia and legislator and politics, to kind of also educate my colleagues on the academic side to be an advocate and to come to the legislature and testify on these policies. And of course, many have since then, but there's also others that are scared to, candidly. Because as Robert mentioned, House Bill 999, it's not just going after coursework or DI, it's also going after tenure. Actually, part of this bill, which is incredibly absurd, threatens accreditors. I mean, I've never seen policy that threatens an accreditor for doing their job. And of course, much of these 2 policies are likely unconstitutional. There's been a very unique partnership between myself and FIRE, which I'm sure many folks in the academic world know FIRE. And FIRE has a brand to be more libertarian. I can't say I agree with them on every policy position, but we really formed a great alliance on much of the concerns that we've seen in the first iteration of House Bill 999. And so I'm going to step back. I feel like I've already said so much, and we'll do what I can to grab questions. And like I said, I'm just watching the floor. So if you see me turn off my camera, I'm just kind of floating a little bit, but I'm listening. But I think it just speaks to how advocacy is so important, because the first version of House Bill 999 was disastrous. The current version is still really, really bad. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but the first version was specifically eliminating majors and minors. This current version does not do that. But a really important aspect of advocacy is you got to watch these bills, because they can change in a heartbeat. So we are approaching the end of legislative session in Florida, which is May 5th. But of course, I'm also concerned of the national consequences, because Florida has really kind of led the way in some of these dangerous policies. And I am always concerned of other states copying us, which is why I think it has been important to show the united opposition across genres, across cultural groups. Many students have been the leaders on this, because faculty are scared to speak up. Students have really carried that weight. And I will say, I have been disappointed in the role of administrators. Administrators and university presidents overwhelmingly have been quiet on all of this. And I understand the concerns for job security, especially since in Florida, we've seen many politicians be inserted as presidents, not always in the context of their qualifications or merits, but often just on their friendships with those in power. So it has had a chilling effect in just people already expressing First Amendment thoughts and free speech. And so to be continued on that front. But again, thank you for this conversation, and looking forward to hearing what folks have on the top of their minds.
to your point, following the legislation has become one of my, and it's not something that I do as an academic, but watching the markup in color of the bills, it's really interesting to watch the evolution. One question for you while we have you, and we're going to go to Sophia in just a moment, is how do you find in your district or around Florida this issue plays? The issue of
yes.
academic freedom. Obviously, Governor DeSantis started this sort of in the K through 12 space. It's now expanded to the higher education space. How salient of a political issue are you finding this?
So it's a really great question. It really just appeals to a base of voters. You know, I've seen some rhetoric, especially on more conservative social media sites around, this university, turned my son into a liberal. You know, you kind of see some of this very demeaning type of rhetoric, coming from conservative spaces. Meanwhile, no one really cares. I mean, I hate to be that blunt, but it's like, you go to a college to grow as a person, to find a career path, and to expand your knowledge base, expand your network, right? There's a lot of reasons why someone goes to either a state college or a university. And I think majority of people, especially when polled, have said, we don't want you to touch this. There was a poll out of the University of North Florida where, again, Floridians responded saying, we don't want the legislature to focus on this. This is not an issue that we really care about. We're more worried about property insurance rates and cost of living in Florida. So it really is a politicized issue on purpose. It's Governor Ron DeSantis is set to run for president. He has to out-Trump Trump. So he does everything he can to try to be as conservative as possible and kind of appeal to this very small but important base for him. And meanwhile, the rest of us are just kind of like, what are you doing? Like, there's been no complaints about this. No one has ever called my office, and now my 5 years of service, to say, I feel like I can't express myself on my university campus. Nobody has ever called me to say, my speech is being restricted, or the class that I took has been indoctrinating. If anything, there could be concerns about how something is graded, or concerns about sexual assault on a college campus. Like, we do get, different issues that come from the college, the collegial environment. But this has never been one of debate or discussion. And in deep contrast, Governor Ron DeSantis back in 2019, and actually before I even got to legislature in 2018, we passed policies that mimic the Chicago school around respecting all perspectives. So we went from there to now, and it's just such a huge shift to the point where, FIRE supported that 2018 legislation and the commitment by the governor and university presidents, 4 years ago. And now they're opposing this bill because it's a smack in the face to what academic freedom is. And of course, there's a lot of concern from those who work in the university system around tenure, because you strive to reach that part of your academic career, only to then have the rug pulled from under you. And those type of threats are incredibly targeted with intent. Remember, in Florida, we've had situations where university faculty members have spoken out against the governor, have served as expert witnesses on different lawsuits challenging the governor's policies. And so that's clearly a connection. It's not a coincidence that we're trying to water down tenure when tenure professors have expressed themselves against the goals of this administration. And the last point I'll make to that too is, we have serious needs in higher ed when it comes to paying our graduate students, when it comes to adjunct professors and their efforts to unionize. Like, my engagement with higher ed has been very much focused on workers' issues and student conduct and student health and well-being. Like, we have students just come to my office actually this week. She can't afford her rent. We're trying to figure out how to help her in that situation. So those are type of issues that we've heard always from higher ed. This, not only was it never asked for, but the attempts to suppress academic freedom are incredibly unpopular. And I just don't think it works, in an everyday electorate. I think it appeals to a very conservative base. But you have people like Christopher Rufo who are just flaming the situation, using really bombastic and inaccurate language describe university programs, and that definitely doesn't help. That creates a lot of contention and conflict when none even existed beforehand.
Thank you so much for that. And to your point, Inside Higher Ed surveyed the presidents of public universities in Florida. Not one would even speak out anonymously.
Yes.
Chilling effect that Robert referred to before you were on is going into the administration as well. And so we're going to go to Sophia. If you can stay with us, we'd love it. We also know that you're in the real world making real policy, and if you have to go, we'd understand. Sophia, to you, if there's one place, as I said earlier, in the country that is most emblematic of the right-wing populist assault on higher education, it's the new college. And so my heart goes out to you, and my gratitude for you for the work that you're doing and for joining us. And I just would love for you to talk about what's happening at the new college, what students are doing, and as Sophia is talking, if attendees would like to post any ideas or questions in the question and answer, we welcome that. Sophia.
All right, thank you so much for your kind words and also for this opportunity to speak on this panel. It's all very exciting. Ground zero is definitely the term that's been thrown around a lot in coverage of what's happening here at New College. I can start by, as fast as I can, giving a quick recap of some of the recent changes that have been happening here on campus. Everything started in January when Governor Ron DeSantis appointed 7 new members to our board of trustees, including Christopher Rufo, who's been mentioned and often credited with sort of inventing the uproar around critical race theory, as well as Matthew Spalding, who is a professor at Hillsdale, the private conservative college we've also mentioned. These people, were assigned to join our leadership. This board very quickly fired our former president, Dr. Patricia Ocker, and replaced her with Richard Corcoran, who is the former education commissioner of the Florida Department of Education, and someone who also had no previous experience with college admissions. Corcoran then went on to, or this board rather, went on to abolish the only DEI-related office here on campus, which only had 4 staff members. So not a very impressive DEI bureaucracy, as people like Rufo might say, and yet a very tangible example of how this board and this new politicized administration is very quickly making moves to stamp out anything vaguely related to DEI here on campus and replace it with something of a classical liberal arts education is the term they often like to use. So anyone who has been keeping up with what's happening here in Florida or at New College, you may already know those details, but I'd also like to talk a little bit more about some more recent developments here on campus as I have experienced them as a student and also especially as a student journalist. The politicization of our administration has not slowed down at all. We sort of started at the top with this board of trustees and with our president, and is now trickling down into other facets of campus life. For instance, some other recent hires New College has had have been Kevin Hoeft and Sydney Gruters for administrations and fundraising, respectively. And these are 2 people who also, again, have no documented experience with college admissions or fundraising, and yet are most well known for their strong ties to the Florida Republican Party, and just showing that this growing politicization of our school becoming more and more transparent. This new board and new administration has been also quite transparent in how they have indicated that they want to get rid of gender studies here on campus, as we might expect. And speaking of tenure too, actually very recently, Richard Corcoran asked 7 faculty members here at New College to withdraw their tenure applications after they had already been approved, which for those that know how tenure works know that that's not something we should be able to do. And as a student journalist, especially, I am extremely concerned about the maintenance of freedom of press and freedom of speech on my campus. I've been the editor-in-chief of my school's newspaper for 2 years, have been on staff for the full 4. And one of the many benefits of doing this on an incredibly tiny campus is we've always had direct connections with the administration. We're able to interview them face to face. That has not been the case this semester. Very quickly, our communications and marketing department, overseen by Corcoran, has been stonewalling us, so to speak, have asked us to filter all questions through them. And very similarly, here on campus, like my fellow students and I, we find out news and information about our school through outside news sources, not through any communication from the administration directly, which has been very unusual for New College. Again, because it's so small, we're very used to having this direct transparency. And it's something the students definitely have always expected. It's a very active student body that wants to participate in that sort of thing. And all communication has been cut off in quite a frightening development, in my opinion. It seems like a lot of changes continue to happen behind closed doors. The issue with the 7 faculty members being requested to withdraw tenure, that's one great example of something we had to find out from the Tampa Bay Tribune. We also see this new administration's attempts to curate a very specific and more conservative student body for the upcoming year. For instance, Richard Corcoran has been offering $10,000 scholarships to transfer students and is specifically marketing this offer to parental right groups. He's also been promising admitted students to, include more traditional intercollegiate sports programs. And he actually very recently announced that he wants to implement Greek life on campus, which probably doesn't sound that odd to your average college student, but here at New College, we're extremely academic focused. We don't necessarily have these programs. All of our sports are student run and kind of more casual. And so the attempts to implement these more traditional aspects of college life is very odd. It's an odd direction of priorities when we continue to have these myriad of problems on campus with funding and these questions of, well, is there any money to, fix the dorms, fix this food situation? Meanwhile, you're pouring this money into scholarships for transfer students. But that's kind of a whole other mess. I will say on the student end, that retention and admissions are a huge problem. Many of my own friends are planning to transfer out of state as soon as possible. There's not much of a desire to stay on campus if you can afford to leave. And I do want to circle back to this concept of national significance. The ways that what's happening here in Florida is just one branch of a greater conservative movement throughout the country. We see in Texas and Ohio a similar DEI legislation being proposed. And even with the 6-week abortion ban too that got signed here in Florida, I think that's a good reflection, kind of the secrecy and the slow transformation of our legislation and our higher education. Just signs that show that this is going to spread if no one speaks up, and it could happen to your campus next, essentially. Not to fearmonger, but that is how it feels here at New College.
That's why we're doing this, Sophia. And I would just say thank you for that. And having read some of your writing on this, and now having heard you speak on this, it's clear to me that the New College is educating its students really well. And this kind of intervention wasn't necessary. Please stay with us. I'm going to turn the webinar over to Timothy Kaufman Osborne, who has been writing about particularly higher education governance as it relates to the issues that we're interested in. Timothy, I'd love your perspective, kind of zooming back a little bit on this.
Sure, thanks. So my task is to take our discussion of Florida and relate it to the current situation of U.S. higher education more generally, and to try to do so in under 10 minutes. It's going to be a bit of a rush, but I'll happily take questions afterwards. So here goes. In January, the Chronicle of Higher Education published an article. It was titled, "What is Happening in Florida?" And at first blush, that question may seem easy to answer, and the authors of the Chronicle article apparently had little difficulty doing so. I quote, "Since the new year," they wrote, "Governor Ron DeSantis and his Republican allies have ramped up efforts to eradicate woke ideology from public colleges," unquote. That answer, I think, tacitly situates Florida within the context of the so-called culture wars. That response, I want to suggest, actually misses more than it reveals. To indicate what's lacking in that response, I offer the following. As everyone I think has indicated already today, Florida's attack on public higher education is providing a blueprint that is being actively emulated elsewhere. Therefore, what's happening in Florida is also happening in Texas, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Idaho, North Dakota, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Kansas, and other states governed by the radical Republican right. The counter-majoritarian agenda of the Republican right, in my view, is to fashion an authoritarian regime that aims to secure by means of raw political power the continued dominance of certain declining and therefore vulnerable elites. If that project is to succeed, colleges and universities must be stripped of whatever autonomy they now hold and so become mere handmaidens of an autocratic state. So on this account, what is happening in Florida is but a window onto a project that is in fact national in scope. So how are we to think about that project? For several decades, I would argue the dominant categories employed in specifically critical analyses of American higher education were those of corporatization and neoliberalization. And those categories effectively called our attention to a number of troubling trends in American higher education. To cite but a few, consider the effective collapse of any meaningful distinction between higher education and vocational training, the emergence of academic capitalism, whereby research is tethered to the imperatives of capital accumulation, and finally, the assessment of a college degree's value exclusively in terms of its financial return. These developments, critics correctly noted, had the effect of extending the rationality of the marketplace as well as the administrative practices of for-profit enterprises into the academy, where arguably they don't belong. The categories of corporatization and neoliberalization remain relevant today. We see their ongoing importance in a press release DeSantis issued earlier this year. There he stated that he means to require Florida's universities, and I'm quoting, to prioritize graduating students with degrees that lead to high-wage jobs, unquote, and by implication, I think, to steer them away from majors that might encourage critical thinking about the conflation of an education with its cash value. In that same press release, DeSantis also indicated his intent to mandate that Florida's larger universities expend at least $50 million each year for what he called STEM-related programs, businesses or industry partners, unquote, thereby promoting higher education's ever more thoroughgoing incorporation within a capitalist economy. These categories, however, do not and cannot account for DeSantis's hostile takeover of New College, his effort to concentrate power in the hands of Florida's Board of Governors, whose members, I would argue, are essentially appointed lackeys, his attack on accreditation agencies that might challenge this consolidation of state power, or indeed his frontal assault on critical race theory. These and other planks in DeSantis's agenda seek to weaken and ideally to eliminate the autonomy that's an indispensable condition of the university's status as a site of free inquiry. If the radical right is to prove victorious in its struggle to hold on to power at a time when the exercise of democracy and specifically the conduct of elections may threaten that power, the right can brook no opposition. Hence, what DeSantis is doing to higher education in Florida is a piece with the right's aggressive gerrymandering of congressional districts, its conquest of the federal judiciary, and its efforts to reduce voter turnout. DeSantis's efforts to render public institutions of higher education mere administrative agencies of the state is readily apparent in the so-called Stop Woke Act and HB 999. Among other things, as we all know, Stop Woke prohibits faculty from teaching students to entertain the merits of critical race theory and hence, for example, the structural underpinnings of white supremacy. HB 999 demonstrates that Stop Woke's ban on certain arguments must be accompanied by mandates designed to ensure that students are instructed in the so-called universal truths outlined in the Declaration of Independence, as well as the eternal verities of so-called Western civilization, which we have good reason to believe are those articulated in the Christian Bible. When bans are joined to mandates, we begin to see how DeSantis reduces education to indoctrination, and we begin to figure out who wins and who loses from that assimilation. If the university is to become little more than an administrative agency of the state, its faculty members must in turn become nothing but those agencies' clerks. That this is so was announced when Florida's attorneys responded to the legal challenge to stop woke. That statute, the attorneys insisted, makes clear, I'm quoting, that state employed teachers may not espouse in the classrooms the concepts prohibited by the act while they are on the state clock in exchange for a state paycheck. And the quotation concludes as follows: the in-class instruction offered by state employed educators is pure government speech, not the speech of the educators themselves, unquote. On that account, just like clerks at Florida's Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles, faculty members are government employees who as such cannot say what the law now forbids. And if they dare to dissent, they render themselves eligible for punishment. Like their employees, the lawyers concluded, Florida's public colleges and universities are but, quote, subordinate organs of the state, unquote. So to return to where I began, what we see in Florida, I think, is the leading edge of a broader national movement aimed at eliminating the necessary conditions of free inquiry. The success of that project requires the cancellation of anything that deserves to be called education. Those who will benefit from education's extermination include those who profit from the wholesale transformation of colleges and universities into workforce training centers. So too, education's end will benefit those threatened by, as well as resentful of, uppity persons of color, especially women. Accordingly, we can now better answer the question posed by the Chronicle of Higher Education. What is happening in Florida is part and parcel of a nationwide agenda that is anti-labor, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, but pro-white, pro-Christian, and pro-patriarchy. This is a counter-majoritarian agenda that weaves together a devotion to capital accumulation, an insistence on ideological conformity, and a concentration of state power. So welcome to the Sunshine State, where Ron DeSantis may be teaching us more than we really want to know about the possible future of higher education within the United States. Thanks.
Tim, you just did a remarkable amount in 10 minutes. Would have taken me a career. Thank you for contextualizing this, and but also for highlighting without any hyperbole the seriousness of what's happening. I want to. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to encourage participants to pose questions in the question and answer, either to the panel generally, to me, or to specific members of the panel. What I'd like to do now is just kind of focus on what's to be done. Obviously, one thing that we're trying to do is highlight these issues, bring light to these issues. And so one specific question I have for panelists is, what's the role of private institutions like Duke University right now in building solidarity with our colleagues at public higher education? How can we be supportive? What is it that we can do in order to become part of the solution? And so, Rep. Eskamani, I see you signing on. Maybe we'll go to you first, since it looks like you're moving.
That would be great, only because, oh, sorry, let me get this right way. Okay. That would be great because we're about to vote on some bills. So I wanted to pop in real quick. So what can folks do? So there are so many things to do and get involved. I mean, first of all, I have really advocated on a campus level to hold your board of trustees accountable. And obviously every state is so different in how a board of trustees is appointed and formed and what their responsibilities are. But it will say in the context of Florida, like our board of trustees at each university or college is appointed by the governor, is appointed by the board of governors, which is basically, by the governor again. And then you have a faculty representative and you have a student representative. And most students have never even heard of the board of trustees. I will speak from my own experience as an undergrad student. My first ever board of trustees meeting was probably my junior year, going to my senior year. And it was an effort to push my university to basically become the flagship PBS station. And I fell into that campaign because it's a long story, but our PBS station locally was being sold to a religious network. I didn't want that to happen. And I kind of just fell into this board of trustees meeting, my first time ever even knowing what it was or why they meet or who appoints them. And board of trustees in the context of academic freedom have the political clout to do something, because chances are they were there because they wrote checks to the governor for political contributions. Unfortunately, most board of trustees are not there based on merit. It's just some sort of personal relationship that got them there, but they're not salary. They don't have the job security, concern, if you will. So kudos to UCF students. About a month and a half ago, they actually came to their board of trustees meeting to testify for academic freedom, testify against the Anti-Woke Act, and really to kind of set the tone and get them on the record supporting diversity. So I think trying to think about, who are those people of influence on your college campus that are there through appointments, through more political structures, and meet with them, talk to them, get them to support, sign on to pledges, support academic freedom, and do that grunt work now and before the legislature, especially if you're in a red state, picks up this mantle and continues on this anti-academic freedom political campaign. And then the other thought that I have is just for students and faculty is understand the legislative process in your state. Again, I've done a lot of just mentorship with a lot of professors. It's actually, an amazing feeling. Like they've taught me so much and I'm like, I can teach you something, right? And so it's very humbling, but to be in a position where, what an amendment is, how to read a bill, as you noted earlier, you have a good understanding of the process. So you can also teach it to others. You can inform your students on it. Bill drafting and the process of legislating, it's almost like another language that can be very intimidating to people who've never done it before, but break through that, the unknown and grasp the process so that if you do have to be that type of advocate at the legislative level, you're ready to go. You already know the process, who your lawmaker is. It's not going to be a learning journey while the train is already moving. You're going to know exactly what to do, where to go, and how to do it. So those two quick pieces of advice I would offer.
That's really helpful. And to your point, at UNC Chapel Hill, during the Nicole Hannah-Jones controversy about tenure, students very much intervened at the Board of Trustees level. The Board of Trustees reversed itself and offered her tenure too late. The damage had been done and she went to Howard. But you're exactly right that that's a place where things can happen. Any other panelists want to comment on that?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think faculty at private institutions tend to think that they're immune to the sorts of legislative encroachments that we're seeing in Florida and elsewhere. And I think they need to be stripped of that notion of immunity. Private institutions are recipients of grants, state and federal financial aid, guaranteed loans, and so forth and so on. And all those forms of funding can be tied to legislative restrictions that can be imposed on private institutions as well. So I think it is important that faculty of private institutions understand that they may not be as thoroughly vulnerable as are faculty at public institutions, but they are not invulnerable in virtue of being private.
Tim, let me push you on that just for one. There's some conversation about if Governor DeSantis became President DeSantis, what could he do at the federal level? And some feel like you can't do at the federal level what's happening at the state level because so much. You seem to disagree with that.
Well, there is only so much that a President DeSantis, I hesitate to even use that phrase. Let's not
say that.
But were Ron DeSantis to become president, it is quite true that education is primarily a state responsibility rather than a federal responsibility. So there would be limited capacity of Ron DeSantis, were he president of the United States, to intervene. But let's not forget that, and here's another phrase I hesitate to use, President Trump, former President Trump, did pass an impose an executive order that basically imposed a tax on institutions that had very large endowments per student, and that tax applied principally to very wealthy private institutions. So there are opportunities for federal encroachment as well.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Sophia, anything you want to say about, because when you got my invitation to this, you expressed some gratitude that people were paying attention. What do you think in terms of support? And then I have a question from the attendees for Robert.
Right. Sort of as a student in the middle of all of this, it's easy to get caught in this bubble and kind of assume that it's a fight that the students kind of need to take on themselves. It's how it feels sometimes in lieu of protests and organizing efforts and the work that my own student-run newspaper does. But considering the national implications, it is something that I think everyone benefits from keeping their eyes on, just in the off chance that this continues to spread to the degree that it does. What specifically private institutions could do to help is maybe a bit out of my scope, but I do think just conversations like these that bring the situations here, you know, in Florida, on Florida campuses, to a broader audience, to folks like you, that already warms my heart to just think that other people are paying attention and are concerned and that want to lend their support and their allyship. So maybe not the most substantive answer, but I'm very happy with the steps being taken by you folks.
Very substantive and an affirmation of our belief in the importance of this program. Robert, we got a question that said, when I was a grad student, some of the biggest pushback we received against unionization and improved wages conditions was tenured professors talking about, quote, how it used to be, and suggesting that, quote, politics was a waste of time. What is the best way to approach more senior professors and academics who are reluctant to engage with politics or the idea of working to change the structure of academia?
Sure. So I'm assuming based on this question that the Matt Lubby was trying to organize a graduate student association or a graduate student union, and there might have been some pushback from senior professors, which I can certainly see, because in essence, the graduate students who work for those professors, and they don't want their labor unionized, even if they might be unionized themselves, right? So this is really tough because there are quite a few professors who wish to, in best case scenario, be apolitical. Sometimes there's many professors who are conservative, if you will, and don't believe in what the union's trying to do or accomplish, don't believe in the idea of a collective voice, right? They're more individualist, and they would rather hash things out on an individual level than the collective voice of the union. The one thing I've seen in these times, because this is what kind of we're talking about here, the time we're in now, that's been the most interesting is the fact that the one conversation I can have with all rank of professors, full professors, associates, tenure track, instructor, lecturers, non-instructional faculty like librarians, is academic freedom. When incidences of academic freedom are threatened on campus, what I get in my union inbox oftentimes comes from full professors who are physicists, who are chemists, who are engineers, and who say, hey, a threat to academic freedom in the humanities is a threat to academic freedom to me. And they become engaged and they become really interested. And even though, like, we go back to last year with HB 7 and the racial prohibitions that were offered by the legislature, I heard from a lot of people in the hard sciences and the engineerings and computer sciences who are like, what happens if I want to teach evolution in class? And they come for that next. So academic freedom, I think, is the one thing, the one conversation you can have that can draw professors who might be reluctant to talk about politics to think of themselves in terms of political actions, because academic freedom is the one thing that touches us all. I have yet to see a professor here contact me and say, aren't those prohibitions against teaching racial concepts wonderful? You know, I haven't seen that. And I was sort of taken back that I was actually getting more comments from the hard sciences than the humanities in that case.
That's really very insightful, Robert, and good for us to know as we look at debates across the country on academic freedom. So we are just about out of time. I want to offer panelists, if they have any last thing that they had hoped to say today that they have not had a chance to say before I say some final words and end the webinar. You've had your chance to express your voice. Good. Okay, well, good. I wanted to make sure your time was well spent. So for those who are attending and for the panelists, this is the first of what I hope will be a series highlighting threats to higher education in the states, at the federal level. As Tim said, the endowment tax, the rhetoric sometimes coming out of the Trump administration about higher education was quite shocking, and no doubt we'll see more of that. And so for those of you who are interested in this topic, please feel free to visit the Keenan Institute website for more on the project on democracy and higher education and the kinds of programs and activities that we'll have. I'm very grateful to our panelists for spending time with us, for doing a really beautiful job of bringing different perspectives to this really, really important issue. It's not hyperbole to say that this is a crisis we're in the midst of, and we're committed in this project to shining light on it and taking the advice of those of you on the panel who are helping us think about what we can do. So thank you very much for what you're doing, for being with us today. Thank you to the attendees for joining, and you'll hear more from us soon. Thanks.